Schultz, and this is a continuation of the interview with my sister Amy Vedder, who is Vice President of the Wilderness Society. We're talking about the importance of nature to people, and I think you'll enjoy it. Find that other people who got into conservation work had similar experiences?
Because of where we were, we would end up finding a lot of people who first went to the Bronx Zoo.
Really?
And that's what got them interested in animals.
Oh my gosh, wow. That's
but
a
I think
very
maybe
different
that's this
way.
seeing
Yeah.
and becoming interested and fascinated and converted. Yeah, which is really different than being in a wild natural area. But that may be why, I love being out with gorillas. It was really important to me. It was incredibly interesting and special. But I could move on and do and work in other areas with other animals.
Right.
And I think part of that was because there was something more fundamental in me than the lure of a single species, no matter how charismatic they might be.
So,
There was still this this other sense of just being in a wild.
because Bill was talking about that yesterday too, that so many people that get into conservation get into a particular species, and they stick with that species. That the two of you were very different in that regard, that you moved away from working with mountain gorillas, which may be the sexiest species you could ever.
I think they probably are. Yeah, yeah.
That you dropped them and went on to something really broader, which is related to sort of what we're talking about,
Yeah.
the whole living landscapes
Yeah.
idea that came up in Rwanda for you. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, just to the first point, I think one of the kinds of things that really fascinate me is the complexity, again, the unpredictability, the many, many, many relationships in a place that I can't yet understand and I'd like to know a little more about. And so all of that fit beautifully when the theme of ecology came along, and the study of all these interrelationships came
sense.
just as I was going through college. And so it was that kind of attraction. How does this work? And can I help to understand it better so we can ensure that it can continue to work in a sort of unfettered fashion? And so that was sort of a fundamental thing that, again, probably was derived from, in a way, maybe that non-exotic experience in nature of being out with the daisies and the crayfish and all.
I remember
the
you
bullfrogs and the
you were
salamanders.
You made a lot of daisy chains, as I remember.
Yeah, yeah. And, a lot of that is just old regrowth,
Right.
not anything
Right.
truly wild.
Right.
But what was your question, though? It was living landscapes.
Right.
Well, there were a couple of things there. One is that you have this landscape. You can't save the species unless you save the interrelationships it does have with others. And for me, just the basics, we couldn't save gorillas unless they had food to eat. So, and nobody had studied that. Nobody knew what they were eating and whether that was limiting their population. So that was the first easy step, you can't
was
save
your
these without that.
That was your dissertation
Yeah,
research.
yeah. And so that was the very first circle of interrelationships. Unless they have food, you're not going to save them. You need enough area with enough food. And then we realized they did. There was reason to work at this, and there was reason for hope. But then, I couldn't be out there without noticing the golden monkeys and the turacos and those kinds of things, and realizing that this whole system of giant lobelia and all was really special. And so we wanted the whole system to be saved. And then the next step was more Bill's step. You really can't work on that and succeed unless you've worked on people's relationship with those areas, those species. And so the landscape got bigger and bigger, from the most wild to areas that maybe could accommodate some use or were accommodating some use to people in Rwanda, in a very altered, converted environment with intensive agriculture and all. How do you make these systems work? And that was the tougher one, I think, because you had park and then intensive agriculture. In most places in the world, we get a much more gentle gradient between the wild the multiple use and then people's more intensive use. And you have a lot more options. How do you find the solutions that allow for people to live in this landscape as well as wildness to continue to exist? And that's a lot of the way we're going right now in the Wilderness Society. We look at the national public lands, and we're not just looking at wilderness. We're looking at how wilderness relates to other uses of our lands, and whether it's energy production or wood production. But how do you allow for wildness to persist and, in fact, thrive in the midst of some other use, and people seeing enough of their interests and their values on those lands to care about how they're managed? So you make sure that you have it well into the future. So that's the bigger landscape.
Right.
It becomes essential if you're going to succeed.
I guess the whole thing that we've been talking about the whole time is human interaction with nature and natural interaction with humans. And
Yeah.
when originally with the whole idea for this interview came up from Linnea, my daughter, who said, why don't you, as an ecofeminist, interview Amy as an ecofeminist? And I said, well, at least as an environmentalist, she doesn't like those ist words.
Yeah. Well, see, with an ecologist or environmentalist, I accept it readily because that's what I work concertedly at. Feminist, I just live that life, but I don't work at it as an organized activity. So I see a difference, how I use the term.
But I think it's very interesting.
Luciana's out.
You're done? You're done?
Yeah. Yeah, you should.
Well, the one thing that I thought was interesting was that when you started to talk about why this work was important to you, it started to feel very much like a spiritual experience that you were talking about.
Yeah.
How it centers you. That's a word that I use to talk about, being in balance with life.
Yep.
How it humbles you.
Yep.
Humility is definitely a spiritual attribute. How it expands you.
Mm-hmm.
All of those things are very much our spiritual attributes and spiritual qualities. And so even though Linnea set this up as an idea of, what the differences are, I think come to find out, we end up being more on the same page than that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And without that spirit and that spiritual connection, you don't have quite the same passion for it. It becomes a job, and that's not the way I want to live my life.
Exactly.
So,
Cool. Thank you.
yeah, it's been fun.
It has.